Welcome to Focus Stack, the podcast where we layer conversations on creativity and photography. I'm your host, photographer and educator Jim Ryman, and in each episode, I'll be sitting down with different photographers to learn about the stories, techniques, and inspiration behind their work. From creative breakthroughs to industry challenges, we go beyond the frame to uncover what shapes a photographer's vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Focus Stacked Podcast. Before we get going with our guests today, let's just take care of the usual YouTube housekeeping stuff. So if you're new to watching the show, please like and subscribe here on YouTube and put the little bell on there to let you know when we post new episodes, and we can just keep growing the audience, and eventually we'll start doing some live streams. Also, if you're interested, we do have an Instagram account that you can follow there for some updates. I'll be posting some behind the scenes, and I'll post announcements when new episodes are available. And if there's any photographers out there that would like to be a guest, we do have a link in the description that has our link tree in it. And if you follow there's a part that says be a guest, and you click that, fill out the form, and then we'll be in touch to get you on a show in the future. All right. So with all of that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our guest today. He's a photographer and educator named Shawn James Loseke. He does a lot of conceptual work, which we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at some stuff with some ICM and some pictorialist inspired work. But let's go ahead and welcome Shawn to the show. Hey, Shawn.
Hi, Jim. Hello, everyone out there in YouTube land.
How you doing?
Doing well this morning. Doing well.
Yeah. So Shawn, usually how I like to start out is just have you talk about your path to becoming a photographer. Where did you start, and where are you at now, and how did you get there?
Well, it's kind of a long story, but I'll try to condense it down. Right. So my love for looking through a camera started at a very young age when I was about 4 years old. I picked up an old twin lens reflex camera at a garage sale. It was jammed up, would not open, probably still had film in it from whoever knows how long ago it had been. But I could walk around and look at the world through the waist level viewfinder. And that completely fascinated me with the idea of cameras and photography. My first exposure to, no pun intended really, but exposure to photography started in junior high school, in between shop classes. One of the metal shop class in my junior high school when I was in 7th grade had a 4-week-long photography section. And that was where I exposed my first black and white film that I could then process myself and print. Other than, prior to that, I played with my dad's camera a bit. He used to photograph a lot in transparency, 35 millimeter transparency film. So I've got stacks of, family photos that are all in transparency film from way back when I was a young lad. But that started, in junior high school, my first foray into actually processing my own film. And then in 9th grade, there was an entire photography class that I was able to go through. In high school, I went through all of my photography classes, including taking some classes at the local university. I was a yearbook photographer, then a yearbook photography editor for 2 years in a row. And the yearbooks under my reign as photography editor won National High School Press Association awards for photography. And so I was pretty proud of that. After high school, I had an idea basically at the time that I was going to be going into the military, and I was in the delayed entry program for the Marine Corps. Completely destroyed my shoulder on a vacation with my stepdad, total anterior dislocation. And that led me down a road of recovery and recuperation and weakness and nerve damage in a shoulder that ended up permanently disqualifying me from armed forces duty. And so then I kind of stumbled around a little bit, tried poli-sci as a major at Colorado State University. Just wasn't really finding my way there, and decided to go back into photography. Went back to my first photography school, took off with it, although it was a bit of a humbling moment, right? So I go into this photography school thinking I was already a pretty good photographer. I knew all that I needed to know. This is going to be an easy associate's degree, going to be in and out. Everything was going to be cool. first day of that school, I realized how little I actually knew about photography. And it was a very humbling experience. And it changed my mindset to I don't know everything, but I want to learn as much as I can. So it kept me in this um, mode of just wanting to basically vacuum up as much knowledge on photography as I could. So I just approached school completely differently. Graduated from that school with a job as a photographer for a company. Traveled around the world, or not around the world for them yet, but I traveled around the country for them. By the time I finished with that job, like it was about a year and a half long, I had driven 130,000 miles and been in every state from the Rockies east. Having grown up in the West, I toured all of the states out in the West as a young child. And so by the time I left that job, the only states I had not been to were Florida and Alaska. Uh,
What sorts of things were you photographing for that?
so for that job, it was a national building company, and so I would photograph, do architectural photography of the buildings, interiors, exteriors, portraiture of the clients that built the buildings and whatnot. They weren't grand, like grand high, really difficult architecture. Most of it was, um, F32 on a 4x5, a little bit of front element swing to change the focusing plane and make sure we had depth of field, and then bracket around a little bit on Fuji Velvia transparency film.
You're talking about using a view camera with that.
Yeah, 4x5 view camera on that. Had a platform on top of the vehicle that I would get onto to get a good high perspective. But I also did a lot of video work for them, a lot of video interview, a lot of video tour. And I mean, I would light the videos like I would light a portrait. And so I had some pretty good dramatically lit interviews. Really introduced me to the world of video as well. But so I was doing portraiture, a little bit of editorial, architecture, and then same with the video, doing video editorial interview type thing, as well as video tours.
So a little
And
bit of
that was
everything.
a little bit of everything. Yeah.
Is
And
that sorry to cut you off, but I
yeah.
was curious, like when you were in school, was that the direction you thought you would go? Did
Yeah,
you
not
have
at all. Not
okay.
at, well, the editorial side. When I was in that first school, I was really kicking off on editorial photography. I was really enjoying that. Um, and when the manager of that advertising department for that company was a graduate of the school that I was attending, and so he came back to that school to look for other photographers. And they announced through the program that this company was going to be coming in. They're going to be interviewing. It was, Morton Buildings was the name of the company. And so it was pretty much sold as it's going to be all architectural photography, blah, blah, blah. And I volunteered to be the first interview. I went into the interview as a way to gain professional experience of interviewing, right? So that I could actually interview for a professional position and not have the expectations of necessarily getting the job, because it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And it wasn't my strength. That architectural wasn't a super strength of mine. And so when they asked, for signing up, I raised my hand first, and they were like, "Hey, whoever interviews first gets the job." And there were other people in my class that thought, "Yeah, but he's not an architectural photographer, so he's going for the experience, get it out of the way." And they weren't worried about it. And I go into the interview, and halfway into the interview, I realize they're not looking for an architectural photographer. They're actually looking for an editorial photographer because of the video interviewing, because of editorial and portrait, because of video interviewing and other things, and that the architecture was really pretty easy because most of their buildings were 1 to 2 stories in height and maybe long, but not technically difficult or challenging from an architecture standpoint, right? Now finding the right angles, making sure you do it right, but nothing too difficult. The most difficult architecture wise was some of the interior photographs, but still very doable. And so halfway through that interview, I realized, oh crap, I'm actually in contention for this job because this is really what I want to do, and this is the strength of my portfolio. And I got the job. So, so started out right out of that school working. I did, for a year and a half, I worked for them, drove 130,000 miles. And that's how they burn out photographers in that job, was just all the driving, because it was all driving, all windshield time. But like I said, the only state I did not get to east of the Rockies while driving for them around photographing was Florida. So that was pretty intense as far as driving, right? After that position, I got a position at Colorado State University in their photographic services department, which was a state classified position working for the college or for the university, where I would provide photographic access, basically, or access to a photographer to all of the different colleges within the university. And what I did for them was a lot of portraiture, a lot of editorial work, some studio work. It was even more jack of all trades than the first job had been, because one day I might be in the studio photographing some fine artwork from an MFA student or one of the art instructors, and then the next day I might be in a lab in the engineering research building photographing a laser, right? So or traveling off to a chill radar site out on the plains and going into an airtight dome with a 28-foot radar dish and photographing people in front of this dish, right? And then the control panels where they were viewing all of the radar information from this giant dish. And so it really bounced around. And while I was working for CSU, I checked off the box of Alaska, because I got sent to Alaska with a video team where they needed my cross skills of video and photography to go on this particular trip. And we were working with a military unit up there. We were hired by a group on a department on the CSU campus called the Center for Ecological Management of Military Lands. And so we had to go in the field with this ranger unit and showed how they handled chemical spills or hazardous waste spills in the field. Say a Humvee gets an oil leaks all over the ground, how do they clean it up, right, to do less ecological damage?
So about what year was this?
That would have been like 1996, 97.
Okay. So that's kind of ahead of the wave, where photographers kind of needed to know both video and photography. I mean, I think now it's an essential skill, but that's kind of like right at the beginning of that.
Yeah, when I started with Morton Buildings, that was in 1994, and it was immediately, as soon as I got there, they ran me through a training with a M2 video camera, a Super VHS video camera, and a Betacam video camera, Sony Betacam. And so I was qualified on all three of those cameras. And then at CSU, they had Sony Betacam equipment. So when they needed me to go with them to Alaska, and they asked if I knew how to run that equipment, and I pulled it out of the case and set everything up, turned everything on, white balanced it, focused it, zeroed it out, and set the exposure. And they said, "Done, you're off to go." So yeah, and went up and spent some time with a ranger unit up in Alaska doing that. So I was able to check off Alaska, and at that point, I only had Florida left on the state list. Worked at CSU for a while. Quickly realized there wasn't a whole lot of upward mobility for me in that position. It was a small department. There were a couple people above me in positions that were going to be there for years. It could have been 15 years before I would actually make any kind of an upward mobile move within that department. And even at that point, I knew I wanted to teach. I wanted to get into the educational side of the field. I enjoyed spreading the idea of photography, spreading photographic skills, and seeing people really light up when they started to understand something. And that all
kind of like teaching magic, right?
Yeah,
that's the way I always think about it. It's like revealing a magic trick.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about like darkroom stuff, chemical darkroom. But I would go out on these photo assignments, and I would be in a lab with a bunch of engineers, and I'd be setting up lights, and I would be explaining the process that I was going to be doing. So I was doing a lot of effectively like shutter drag work, where I'd combine strobe equipment as well as long exposure ambient to get a sense of movement and still sharp focus and fine detail when the strobe would fire. And so I'd be explaining this to them, and I'd have these engineering graduate students with these perplexed looks on their faces. They just could not fathom what I was talking about. And this was still the day of Polaroid. So I'd put a Polaroid back on my Hasselblad 500C, fire off, an exposure, process it, show it to them, and their eyes would just bug out. And when you refer to it as like magic, yeah, they thought I was some kind of magician coming in here, because these were guys working with lasers, right? Working with like water projects and things like that, and they just really couldn't figure it out. So they thought that was all pretty cool, and I really liked that instructional aspect where I was teaching them about photography and teaching them this technique, right? So I worked at CSU right up to 2000, and decided I'm going to go back to school for my BFA. Because at the time, I only wanted to teach higher ed. I wasn't really interested in teaching like junior high or high school.
And you got an associate's from the first school. Yeah,
the first school was an associate's degree as an associate of applied science. So it's very technical, incredibly technical school. Very little in the way of fine art, right? So it's very creative still, but very technically oriented. So like we had a zone system class for zone system photography that was the entire quarter as a quarter system. So 12 weeks of zone system. And our final exam was one sheet of paper, one test strip, one piece of film, and it was pass fail, right? So, and you spent the first 11 weeks figuring out the ISO of your film, perfecting your metering technique, really working on your development technique, so that when you get to that point of developing, exposing the negative absolutely correctly based on the true ISO of your film, developing it very, very well. And so that when you go to make the print, you would make a test strip along the rebate edge of the 4x5 and do D-max print. And your print had to be at D-max print, and you couldn't burn or dodge, right? So it had to really incorporate all of those things to get like as close to a perfect print as you could in one shot. So it was intense. It was that level of intensity all the way through the 2-year program, basically. So yeah, at CSU, went back to get my BFA in fine art. It was a completely fine art program, very low on the technical side. It was almost scary how low on the technical side it was. It was like, here's a camera, figure out how to make it speak for you.
That's kind of been my experience. Programs sometimes are very technical, or they're very conceptual. It all depends on whether or not they're thinking about it from the fine art perspective, or if they're thinking about more from the career perspective. And really, I think the happy middle is where a really successful program falls, I feel like, anyway.
I agree. You have to have a good bit of technical so that you can understand it. You got to know those rules so that you can start breaking those rules better, right? And handing somebody a 4x5 and kind of like being like, go figure it out and use it to express your voice. When people had no idea how to even make it work, right? The class had, at the time, that department had a set of old Speedotron flash units, a big Speedotron bank and heads that plugged in. And this was old enough, and this old Speedos that did not have any kind of a locking mechanism on the cable. And those scared me because I had seen and heard horror stories about those and people pulling the cables out while the pack was charged and it arcing and sending you to the hospital. And if you hopefully lived through it. And so the very first thing the instructor did when he pulled them out was he told them how not to hurt themselves with it, which I thought was really good. But then he did such a fantastic job of telling you how dangerous it was. Nobody used it.
Oh, yeah. I know when I teach lighting, I'm like, don't do this because you're going to get a fireball. Don't do this because you're going to get electrocuted.
So, and then they end up getting rid of those because I even talked to him about it and I said, those things are deadly. You need to get rid of them and get something else. And he upgraded the packs to, at the time, some Norman packs that at least had the screw-on locks. and things like that. So, and then after that, people actually started using the strobes in class, but they still had there was no lighting instruction. I mean, they didn't go through any kind of lighting patterns or anything like that. Uh, and so it was really strange for me because I had a boatload of technical experience going into here. And when I was entering the program, I had a heart to heart with the instructor, and because he would get professional photographers all the time wanting to get a degree, would come to him and say, well, I want to take your classes, but I don't want to start at the beginning. I want to start halfway through your program. And to me, I think that's rather insulting to the program. And it's insulting to the instructors. It's like, well, I'm just supposed to believe that you have all this. You can't prove it. That's what a portfolio is supposed to be able to do, is prove your abilities. And they wouldn't really share their portfolios that much, to say, well, I know what I'm doing. And so I sat down with him, and I knew this because scuttlebutt in the university, when I was working for the same university, I would hear these things. And so I sat down with him and I said, look, I don't know your program well enough to try to tell you where I belong in it. So I would like to start at the beginning and work my way through your program. And it kind of floored him. He was expecting me to come in like saying I should start in the middle of your program, or you should just pass me all these lower classes and give me credit for them. And he asked me more about why I wanted to do that too. And I said, my goal is to teach, to become a photography instructor eventually. And I want to experience as many different ways as I can to teach the basics of photography. So he initially said, what you're going to learn here is the vernacular of fine art photography. You will not learn anything technically, right? He's like, we do teach some technical stuff. He says, but your technical level is way above our whole department. So you're going to learn the vernacular of fine art photography. And starting from the beginning, I think in this program and learning it from the basics on up with that vernacular in mind will make you a better instructor overall.
Yeah, totally.
So, and I was like, let's do it. Let's go. And it was kind of there was only one adjunct instructor and the main instructor in this program. And it was kind of an unspoken, but kind of agreed upon thing between the three of us that nobody would mention my background to the rest of the students. And I was just going to be a student in the class. I didn't blurt out answers. I didn't just immediately jump up and answer everything. If nobody else in the room was answering, one of the whatever instructor was there would ask me. Finally, they'd be like, "Well, Shawn, what do you think it is?" And I would answer the question.
I do that. I have a student in one of my classes right now, who's very technically savvy, and I'll ask a question and I'll see he knows the answer, but then I'll kind of wait, just let somebody else have a chance, and we kind of have that agreement. If I like ask him directly, what's the answer, and he'll shout it out then.
What I think happens with that psychologically in the class is that the students see another student answering it, and they think, what am I not doing that this student's already doing? Is there books that I need to read, or do I need to pay closer attention? And it kind of makes them want to be a better student because this one student is performing well. So let's try to keep up with those student. And so it wasn't until like halfway through the second year of the program that people actually figured out I had a much longer previous path in photography. And a lot more training and whatnot. And I think when we got into they had a beginner and advanced darkroom. And when we got into the advanced darkroom, the work that I was pushing out almost immediately out of that advanced darkroom was, they were like, there's something different about you. Because you walk in and you're at home with those enlargers. Nobody's having to reiterate any of the enlarger training with you. And you're automatically printing large, and you're automatically getting like these really awesome prints. Within an hour, you have a finished print. And it's taking us 4 hours to get to a finished print. And when you go in to roll your film onto the processing reels, you go in with 6 rolls and you're done rolling your film before somebody else is done with 1 roll. Right. And it's like, you have a whole lot more experience here that is just not natural for this year of students. So they eventually figured out that there was more to me. And then we kind of let it out of the bag.
Mm.
Um, but by that point, they realized when I would look at their work and I would encourage them, I was honestly, giving them honest feedback and encouraging feedback. Um, and then they kind of felt like they couldn't give me any feedback, but at that I'd already established that I wanted their feedback as well, and that their feedback was important to me. So they just kept at it, and they just thought, well, Shawn's kind of like our unofficial TA in class,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if you have a question, go ask Shawn, right? Especially if it's a technical question, go ask Shawn. And I would refer them back to the assignment and keep them on track with the assignment. And I wouldn't give them tips to like catapult them ahead of where they should have been on the learning curve,
Mm.
which the head of the program really appreciated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that.
So, yeah. So I kept them where they needed to be to get the most out of the education that they needed to get at that time, which worked out really well. So I graduated from that program, did my BFA thesis in Italy on a study abroad. Stayed a little past the study abroad time, so spent some time in Italy, um, and came back. Started applying for grad schools, working other positions. Had a couple medical setbacks that kind of kept me out of doing some things, and kept working freelance and other jobs and whatnot. And eventually got into starting my MFA and went to get my MFA. And my whole point in going straight for the MFA too is because my information at the time that I had was that if I wanted to teach higher ed, I needed to have an MFA. Later, I would find out, depending upon the institution, I could have been teaching all along.
Mm-hmm.
And working my way up to still teach into other schools. So by the time I got around to actually applying for some jobs in some higher education positions, I already had my MFA.
Yeah.
And so I was,
I will say, from somebody who's hired photography faculty, the MFA is kind of a golden ticket in some ways.
yeah.
Like, it definitely makes it a lot easier to hire for higher education with the
Well,
MFA.
yeah, and I knew that after the fact, right? But initially, when I found out, you mean I could have been teaching with my BFA? My initial thought was I could have been teaching while getting my MFA
Mm.
and making myself but still having more teaching experience. So because otherwise I was caught in this catch-22 of I had an MFA but I had no teaching experience,
Yep. And
no quantifiable teaching experience.
that's typically what happens when people come out of MFA programs. Like, they have the degree, but one of the other requirements
Yeah.
is a minimum of 2 years teaching. So it's like, how do you get the job you went to school for if you
Unless
if
you
you
happen to go to a program
Mhm.
that had where as a graduate student you could be a TA for the
Mhm.
undergraduate
Yeah.
program. Right. But
That's the way the program I went to. I taught pretty much. I assisted the first year and taught 2 classes each semester in the next 2 years, so I was able to get that.
right, right.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I did my MFA all online though.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I know you did it online at a time kind of early in online photography education.
Yeah, I started in 2011, fall of 2011.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of
Um,
like kind of early.
yeah, and the school that I went to, they changed their LMS like 3 times over the course of my doing my MFA. It took me 5.5 years effectively to get my MFA though. I was doing it
Mm.
part time because I was working for a company at that point. I was the only photographer in their marketing department, in their creative department for their marketing, feeding 4 graphic designers effectively.
Mm.
So, and there were 4 different product lines, and ideally it was 1 graphic designer per product line. Didn't quite work that way, but that was the ideal part. But it was only one of me photographing all the products, doing video production of all the products, training videos, advertisements, catalog photography, POP photography, all kinds of different things. So products in use, products in the studio for online catalogs and for whatnot, for going on to Amazon, stuff like that. So um, I was I was busy. I was working like 60-hour weeks, going to school, and halfway through the program, my son was born. And so I didn't really sleep.
Yeah.
Especially after my son was born. Even before that, I wasn't getting a whole lot of sleep, but I would come home from work, try to spend as much time with my family as I could, give my wife a little bit of a break with our son. It wasn't a whole lot. Get them to bed, and then I would come down to my office and start working, doing my homework. And that was a super, super busy time. And shortly after I got my MFA, I started looking for work teaching higher education, and that's where it was like hitting that catch-22 of, well, you've got the degree, but you've got no solid experience teaching. So I was applying for everywhere. Got hired on at RIMCAD, Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. Taught a couple courses there one fall. The next spring, I didn't catch any courses, but then I ended up, my gallbladder blew up, and I was in the hospital for a while with emergency gallbladder surgery. Recovered from that, got into that next fall, and got back with RIMCAD and be like, let's teach some more classes. Left the company that I was working for doing the 60 hours a week and just decided I'm going full force into teaching as much as I can. And I was teaching foundations courses in the fall of 2019. 2020, got back into photography courses. Shortly after that, started teaching 2 courses per term, which was the full load that I could do. Later that year, COVID happens. Stuff falls apart at some other schools. I start picking up classes at some other schools until it culminated last fall. I was teaching 6 classes across 3 different campuses. I don't recommend that. That was a lot.
that's the adjunct life. Yeah.
Yeah. Doing the adjunct hustle, getting as many classes as I could, because I was not working another job. That was my job, teaching. And because of the low pay of adjuncts, it was like having to do that much. And then circumstances led to me being able to achieve a full-time position at RIMCAD. And now I'm the new photography program lead.
Congratulations.
Professor. Thank you. And so I've had people say, well, now you've achieved your goal. And I said, I've achieved one of the goals. I have more goals. And as a rank of assistant professor, the next goal is rank of associate professor, and then rank of full professor. But at least they have defined pathways to achieve it. So
good.
Which is great now, because they didn't always.
No, I know.
So that's the next plan, is to keep moving. I'm really excited about being program lead. It still does teach. I still do teach, as well as do some administrative work. And so I'm really kind of excited about the possibilities going forward. The school's going through a bunch of changes academically and on the administrative side of the academic side, all preparing for growth. They've got some pretty ambitious growth goals. So it's going to be interesting to see how well they do that. But right now, RIMCAD's campus is a little under 3,000 students total, combined online and ground. And so they're looking to grow that significantly in the next few years, especially the campus-based students, to increase campus attendance and whatnot. So super excited about it. Got a good group of people that I'm working with, and gonna be looking to hire some more. So it's an interesting thing. But I'm also I had started a process of developing a way to tier adjuncts, to rank them through time, experience, and professional development. The current provost we have is super excited about this idea, because there was no previous way to even really rank adjuncts before. And so this kind of ties into that, kind of gives the adjuncts a little bit of incentive to keep working and keep trying hard. Gives the college a little bit of a benefit from maintaining adjuncts over time, reducing adjunct churn, onboarding costs, and things like that, for a little bit of extra compensation for those adjuncts as they go up in tiers. Plus, it kind of ranks them into a point of when you're looking to hire somebody into a full-time position,
Mm-hmm.
those are the first people you go to.
Yeah.
If you happen to have tiered adjuncts for your program. If you don't,
Yeah.
you're back to the normal model of hiring. But if you've got tiered adjuncts in your program, those are your first go-to people to try to get. So,
Yeah. Makes sense.
yeah. So that's kind of really, that's pretty condensed really for my life story.
Yeah. No, I know. I was wondering if you wanted to maybe jump into your work now. Is
Yeah, we can
this a
jump.
good transition for that?
Yeah.
All right, let
Um,
me go ahead and I'm going to throw your website up on the stage. And if anybody wants to check out Shawn's work, there is the URL. All right, Shawn, you're in the driver's seat. Walk us through
okay.
your work here.
Yeah.
I'm excited to
So,
see some.
so yeah, the stuff that I kind of like to, that kind of gets me as a photographer is um, memory, collective memory type of an idea, melancholic, nostalgic ideas, um, uh, things like that. So I'm really into like black and white photography and toning black and white photography. Little, pretty conceptual with some compositing here and there. But otherwise, I still like to create things in camera too. Like, so the intentional camera movement type work, I've become really kind of fascinated with. And to
Yeah,
me,
in the introduction I mentioned ICM, but I didn't
yeah,
necessarily explain what it was. So
yeah, right.
I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so ICM, intentional camera movement, right? It's the dreaded thing when you're teaching photographers is to make sure they're using a shutter speed fast enough to avoid camera shake, right? So that little tiny bit of camera shake that knocks everything out of focus gives you an unsharp photo because they photographed it a 30th of a second instead of the 60th or 1/125th, right? Well, ICM is like intentionally shaking your camera, right? To add that little bit of movement into it, right? So it's no longer implied movement, it's actual movement because you're actually creating a
Mm-hmm.
blur. But it's also dragging the shutter long enough so that your subject, at least how I'm doing it in this photo here, this main photo on the, let's see if it'll just go to the single one. Um, with this photo here, it's dragging the shutter long enough that the people walking off of the train are blurring themselves just a little bit, but then I'm moving the camera in addition to that. So, and it's a really rather violent shake of the camera. I just like
Mm-hmm.
twitch the camera. In fact, I think a lot of the people coming off this train thought I may have had some sort of disorder. The way they were looking at me, because I was standing there with my camera, kind of like shaking it at them and just doing this twitch. And to me, it's just like, oh, that's just going to make them ignore me that much more.
Yeah.
So, um, so it's intentionally moving the camera to create a blur, create that sense of movement and that sense of memory without it being a specific memory, right? So it
Yes.
triggers this universal type of a memory type of an idea with it.
It's kind of like a flash as you're like moving. Like, in this case, like you can kind of, it takes you back to maybe transferring between trains, and it's kind of
Yeah,
just like a flicker of something you may have caught a glimpse of.
right. And it's that flicker of a memory or something as
Yeah.
well, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it's been a real fun thing to do. And I don't always do it with people. Sometimes I just do it with landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
And
so
you have some of those too in here, right?
yeah, I've got some of those as well.
Okay.
Um, so I can pop back out of here and scroll down. Alternative processes is something that I'm really into as well, like this Van
Mm-hmm.
Dyke Brown.
Mm-hmm.
These are some of the pictorial stuff, but here's an example of just kind of a landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and this has got some heavy post production in it to get the warmer tones to it and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but this happened to be a very cloudy, very high wind day on a nature preserve
Mm-hmm.
after they had done some prescribed burns. So there
Okay.
was a lot of black, sooty material in the air. Some of the trees were covered in soot as well. And so it was just really dark and kind of post apocalyptic. And I had to spend about an hour cleaning my camera afterwards because of the high wind and the dust storms that were going on. But it was things kind of like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and uh, same location, different. This was almost a year later.
Hmm.
But I find for the work that I like to do out here like this, I find the time of year to be better in the wintertime, late fall in the winter when all the deciduous trees are in dormancy. So you
Hmm.
get that skeletal type appearance with the trees. To me, it works better than a fully leafed out tree when I'm trying to do it.
Yeah.
And I do have some other examples. There's another train one there.
Yeah.
Uh, Downtown still.
Hmm.
That some more ICM here.
Hmm.
And you can see a smattering of images, and you'll see as I go through here that I'm also a lover of the square format, right?
Yeah.
Um, my two favorite film cameras are my Hasselblad and my Diana.
Nice.
Um, and one of the reasons I like the Diana, this is a good example of a Diana image. And this is a straight print. There's no
Hmm.
burning or dodging or anything else.
Hmm.
No special trickery as far as giving you the soft focus in areas. That's the Diana, right?
Yeah.
You get focus fall off at the edges as well
Hmm.
as exposure fall off.
For the people in the audience that might not know what a Diana is, it's kind of a cheap kind of plastic toy camera. You don't have one handy, do you? I'm just looking in my studio to see if I have one on the
I'd
shelf over
have to dig under my desk to grab one.
there. Yeah.
We can
Um,
definitely we can throw. I can give you some images to throw up there too. So
oh well, I know Lomography now produces the Diana, so people can get
yeah, they
them
sell them
from
brand
there.
new ones again.
Yeah.
Originally started. It was a camera originally available as a toy camera in the late '50s, early '60s,
Hmm.
and they sold for about $1.50 to $2 at that time period. They use
Hmm.
120 roll film. They don't use the whole width of the 120 roll. They're about
Hmm.
4.5 centimeters, I think, square, as
Hmm.
opposed to like 6 centimeters square for the Hasselblad. So slightly smaller negative area,
Hmm.
but they're very constraining as well
Hmm.
because they have three aperture choices marked by a
Hmm.
cloud partially covering the sun,
Yeah.
and they have two shutter speeds, bulb and instant.
Yeah.
Um, and I had my shutter speed and my apertures tested at one time, and it's basically like f8, f11, and f16.
Okay.
Mine
Yeah.
weren't exactly 8, 11, and 16. It was like 7.4, 8.9, and like 11.7 or something like that,
Hmm.
right? But the shutter speed was 1/90th of a second, and then instant. And they're designed to use 400 speed film.
Hmm.
Um, I used it for my thesis in Italy, but I used Berger 200 film that was super fine grain 200 speed film, and I would push it basically. Um,
Hmm.
but and I looked for the correct lighting situations, and a camera like that, you have to like really learn the lighting situations, how to work well with the camera. But
Yeah,
with that,
definitely.
but with that constraint of that camera, it really increases your creativity, right? So
Yeah,
because
because
you have
it
to,
kind of takes the technical out of it. You're just
yeah,
looking for it. You're looking for the light, you're looking for the composition,
well,
and
and
then
it makes this really weird ratcheting sound when you advance the film. And
mhm,
some of the students in the program with me initially, they weren't used to being around me when I used a Diana because I'd use the
mhm,
photograph alone. But in
mhm,
Italy, I always seem to have somebody with me most of the time, and
mhm,
I'd carry the camera around in my coat pocket. I'd
mhm.
pull it out, I'd take a picture and go ratchet, 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 and then stick it back in my pocket and walk off. And they're like, "That's what he's photographing."
Yeah,
Then they'd see a print and they'd look at the print and they'd be like, "That's not what that looked like when I was with you."
yeah, because they
Um,
have like a very like like you can see it in this shot here, the way that the sharp spot is in the center of the lens, and
yeah,
it kind of falls out towards the edges.
and there's another one. I forget exactly where it's at in here.
I
Uh,
see. I saw some shots that definitely look like Italy in there.
yeah, there's a lot of Italy in
Ugh.
here.
Yeah.
Hasselblad and Diana as
Okay.
well.
Oh, and
Um,
your overlapping frames there with is that also with the Diana?
yeah, yeah, it was. So
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah,
find.
with toy cameras like this, you're the one that advances the film, so you can kind of choose to like half expose a frame and then
Right.
overlap, which is kind of fun.
Oh, I don't have it up in here. I'm not seeing it. I'll have to add it. There's a
Okay.
couple particular Diana frames that when they're reviewed, oh no, here it is. When I took this picture, students that were, fellow students that were with me were like, that was a well lit piazza or a
Mm,
piccolo, right? Or vicolo. That was a well lit vicolo, little small alleyway in Cortona, Italy.
mm-hmm.
And they're like, how did you make that photo out of that? And I said, well, I don't have many settings on the camera, but I know how to use them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
um,
Drop the
and
aperture down.
right, because when I was photographing, I knew what I wanted to get from it,
Mm-hmm.
and so I would adjust it in the ways that I could adjust it. But then to them, they looked like they thought I was doing snapshots,
Mm-hmm.
um, because when I would go out with my Hasselblad, I was totally different. With my Hasselblad, I would have a tripod. I would set it on the tripod. I would take time framing it up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh,
Oh,
so
actually, I have a question for you about that.
yeah,
Did you can you go back to the image that you were just on?
yeah,
I'm noticing that the edges, is that like a handmade negative carrier that you're printing with that's creating that kind
yeah,
of off filter look? Nice.
yeah. Good,
Okay.
good catch there, Jim. Because my one of my ideas in that thesis was that I was wanted to play with the edge.
Mm-hmm.
I did
I
not
see
want a
that.
sharp defined edge. So I had to make my own negative carrier for an enlarger I was using on the little darkroom in Italy anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I made inserts that I would use because I made a negative
Mm-hmm.
carrier that would work for my Hasselblad, but then it would be too large of an opening for the Diana. So I made little inserts that I could put the Diana film in that would then go into the negative carrier, and I hand cut them, and I made about 8 different inserts,
Okay.
and I made them so that I could actually rotate them or flip them
Uh-huh.
180 degrees, and so I could make a different edge effect for every single photo of the 20
Nice.
images that were in my thesis show. Um, and so
Um,
this
yeah,
was one of those
just
from
knowing
that.
your work, I can see how this kind of planted seeds moving forward.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it's been this evolution of ideas that have been, in my head, that have just been kind of growing on each other. And when I had these up for the thesis show, because I had to do a thesis show in Italy, the head of my program had told me that he said, I don't think the Italians are going to like your prints because they're expecting a nice traditional square hard
Oh.
edged thing,
Mm-hmm.
and um, um, I actually had to negotiate the space for there were 3 of us and that were there that were doing our senior thesis shows, and I was the one that had to go find the space and negotiate the use of the space for it. And so I got the prime location as far as the first floor when everybody would see it when they walked in.
Mm-hmm.
And so more Italians saw my work than they saw the others, but I had more coming up to me and telling me how much they liked the edge treatment
Mm-hmm.
because it was breaking away from that traditional hard edged frame and whatnot. And so it was
Yeah.
like their reaction was the opposite of what the head of the program thought it would be. Um, but yeah, when I would use like the Hasselblad, like these are all Hasselblad, even though they're cropped.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but even like this one, right, which was also in Italy,
Mm-hmm.
the way that I photographed was different with the 2 cameras. With the Diana, I made it look like I was doing snapshots. I'd pull it out, make a quick adjustment, go click,
Mm-hmm.
advance the film, and walk off.
Sure.
The Hasselblad, I took time to compose. I was
Mm-hmm.
working on a tripod, so I could actually really consider the image and things like that, and
Mm-hmm.
just even approached photography very differently in that way. But then, this is a Hasselblad image too, but it's
Mm-hmm.
got a lot of post production work to it,
Yeah.
uh, and some composite work.
Mhm.
The subject here, her movement is actually from a different photo, and placed into this one, and then with like a field type blur, but a customized field type blur
Mhm.
to kind of really mess with the image. And I took this one further. Um, Again, I'm not the palette here rotates occasionally, so I'm not sure where it's at, but I have here it is, um, a Van Dyke Brown version of that too.
Nice.
Right. where I'm further playing with the edges again,
Mm-hmm.
because the Hasselblad doesn't exactly lend itself to that. It just needs that clean edge so that you
Yeah.
can see the little Hasselblad marks on the left-hand side of the image as well.
Right. Right. You got to have
But
those little notches there.
yeah, because then the
Yeah.
people in the know are going to be like, "Ooh, that's with a Hasselblad."
Yeah.
Uh,
But
but then,
can we take a step back? There might be people that don't know
yeah.
what Van Dyke Brown is, so I just kind of wanted to maybe just touch on that real quick.
So I'll do that while we've got a few Van Dyke Browns here, right? So
Okay.
this image
Yeah.
is at the top of this particular scroll next to that first ICM image too, and then some other things from Italy with Van Dyke Brown. So Van Dyke Brown is a printing out process. It's an archaic form of printing from the late 18 or from the 1840s, um, and it uses silver nitrate
Mm-hmm.
in the emulsion that you do, and you paint that emulsion onto a paper,
Mm-hmm.
and create. In this case, I created digital negatives, and all of these images here actually that are all Van Dyke Brown all come from film, but I wanted them larger than the film base, so I had them I digitized them, created a larger digital negative, and then use that digital negative on top of the paper you've coated in the light sensitive emulsion, and then use an exposure box and then create the print. The blue one down on the lower right is a cyanotype, which is another form of printing out process, invented a little bit earlier than Van Dyke Brown, but right around in the same like 5 years, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
1840s. Yeah.
yeah, mid 1840s again. And the cyanotype was originally created as a way to copy notes effectively,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Blueprints.
But then it became
Mm-hmm.
used for blueprints, but
Right.
also Anna Atkins, a very famous photographer who was not credited for any of her work really until like the
Mm-hmm.
1970s.
First photographically printed book was by
Right,
Annie Atkins.
was by
Yeah.
Anna Atkins, and she wasn't credited till like the early 1970s for that, right? Because it didn't
Mm.
have her name on it. But she was using cyanotypes to do studies of flora.
Mm-hmm.
You know, little like this, but it was mostly like pressed image,
Mm-hmm.
pressed
Contact
flowers, pressed
prints.
plants,
Yeah.
contact printing the plants themselves as a way to study. So that goes into the scientific aspect of photography,
Mm-hmm.
how it was used in science, how scientists were mostly the first photographers were also scientists because they were creating their own light sensitive emulsions.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and
Well,
so, yeah,
the bastard child of science left on art's doorstep, right?
yeah, that's one way to look at it. Yeah. So I always like to call it, it's an art supported by a science.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you get into the analog side of photography, you really have to kind of understand the scientific process and
Mm-hmm.
apply the scientific process when you're making prints. You have to develop a theory, then you have to test that theory, and then
Mm-hmm.
you go back and make changes. And that's you make a test strip, you find your time, you make a print. Do you need to burn? Do you need to dodge? Do you need to adjust your contrast? And
Mm-hmm.
those are all changes to your theory that you then make those changes, apply it, and test that theory again, right? So you have to take notes. You have to really record what you're doing. You have to understand the process. And in the darkroom, it's the same thing with shutter speed and aperture that you have in the camera. ISO is fixed just like with film cameras, but depending upon your roll of film, but it's different, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But then I still carry over digitally to do a lot of work. This is another series I did with Diana to get that um,
Mm-hmm.
really kind of sharp centered area and the focus falling off. And it's not just shallow depth of field fall off. It's a very different kind of focus fall off. It's very unconventional, and I had several comments on the Diana series in Italy of people felt they were romantic, like romantic
Mm-hmm.
images, dark,
Sure.
brooding, memory laden.
Mm-hmm.
I had students say, "This is how I remember a dream,"
Mm-hmm.
um, and your fellow students as well as other artists say things like that. This is how I remember a dream. But I've got Diana mixed in with Hasselblad all over the place. A lot of landscape work.
Mm-hmm.
Diana here. Again, more custom field blur type things, but it's all kind of leading up into the ICM currently. And well, where's it at? I apologize if I'm
some of
scrolling.
the newer work up at the top, I think, at least on my screen. You said this rotates on occasion? Yeah,
On
there we go.
occasion. Yeah. So here's some of
Okay.
that newer work, and then an image like this.
Mhm.
I have a whole series currently like this that I'm running. It's going to have a show going up shortly. And the name of the show is called Remnants. They start out with cell phone photos. So
Mhm.
these are originally captured with cell phones. And then they're the remnants of a bygone period of agriculture. Um, Old family farms that these buildings existed at one time on these old family farms, and now most of the farm is either sold off for development or
Mhm.
to corporate farms, right? So these are remnants of a bygone period of agriculture near where I live. Um, and so they start off as a cell phone photo. And then they're taken into Photoshop for some post production where I add layers of different textures and then use masks and blending modes to bring them in at different levels and then play with the colors and convert them to black and white and then add toning back in on top of it. And then add in the different texture layers and whatnot. So
And then that sort of like brushed edge, or the kind of more organic edge, I should say.
yeah, it's not quite a deckled edge because deckled edges
Mhm.
tend to have too much of a pattern as well. So it's a
Mhm.
very, very organic live edge type of a thing,
Mhm.
breaking that edge apart. Because it's reinforcing that idea of a memory of a time past, of a melancholic time as well. And it's
Mhm.
not putting it square into a box. It's allowing your thoughts and ideas to kind of bleed
Mhm.
out of the image a little bit. Um, it's still enough to hold you in, but you get to the edges of it, and it kind of feels like you just kind of drift off a little bit. So
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that this kind of pulls together a lot of the different things you experimented along your path. So you've kind of got like this idea of the Diana is kind of like a point and shoot, very similar to like a cell phone.
yeah,
And so you're taking those images and then you're applying those edge treatments and the blurs and that idea of memory and nostalgia and
yeah, yeah.
melancholy. And it's really all kind of coming together in this work.
There happen to be a
And
bunch of
about
them
how
down
big are the
here.
prints? When you print these, about how big do they print out at?
So yeah, that's I've got a bunch of different sizes that I'm putting together for this show, all the way from 9 by 12 up to a little bit larger print about this size.
Hmm.
I even have some that are 18 by 24 and 24 by 36.
Okay.
So here's like
And the cell
a
phone
I mean,
images are holding up at that 24 by 36
yeah.
pretty well.
So
Oh
24
yeah,
by
nice.
36. Yeah. So yeah, I mean the biggest detraction of the cell phone image would be the lower bit depths from the cell phone.
Mhm. Sure.
But yeah, and the ability for AI assist on enlargement and whatnot to maintain some resolution
Yeah.
is keeping them together pretty well.
Yeah.
But any kind of slight loss in resolution is kind of clouded over by a
Yeah, I was
lot of
gonna
the
say,
right.
yeah, a lot of the effects you're applying probably hide some of those cell phone traits.
Yeah, some of the texture is brush steel, just a panel of brush steel,
Hmm.
grass with frost on it, different
Yeah.
clouds, things like that. So some of it's organic texture, some of it's mechanical texture, and then some of it's like different clouds too. Because some of the
Hmm.
some of the clouds in these photos were not clouds that were there, but
Hmm.
they've been. I did not use sky replacement necessarily,
Hmm.
but just another layer on top of it to bring in some of the effect of the clouds. Uh,
Nice.
so some of them, the clouds are actually there, some of them they're not. Um, so yeah, I mean
Cool.
that's a strong overall look at all of
Yeah.
it.
Well, thanks for sharing. That's yeah, there's a lot to take in here, and I definitely encourage anyone watching this, spend some time checking out this, because there's a lot of great stuff from Italy and the different techniques you're using with the Diana or the Hasselblad or the cell phone, and then some of the Photoshop work you're doing in here as well. So
yeah,
cool stuff.
cameras are tools, right? Cameras are tools,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it's how you use that tool. There's a lot to be said on how you can use the different tools.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what we mentioned earlier. You know, there's those programs that are so technical, and then there's those ones that are so conceptual, and they kind of don't worry about the technique as much. And
Yeah.
I can see that you're really kind of combining your experiences from both of those sort of like educational backgrounds. So very cool.
Yeah. And one of the things I tell my students all the time is learn the rules so that you can break the rules with intent,
Yeah,
right? Because art is created through intent, right?
exactly.
And if you can know those rules and you're breaking them purposefully, the communication levels of your imagery goes out the roof, right? I mean, it just if you just stumble across something, I mean, happy accidents are great for ideation and to open up a new world to you, but you can't rely on happy accidents to get you through everything, right? So
Yeah.
learn from happy accidents, but learn the rules, learn how to break the rules. So you're doing that all intentionally.
Nice. You know, normally I close out for advice for students, and I don't know if that kind of
But
answered that question there, but I don't know if there anything else that you might want to, some parting words for up and
yeah,
coming
the
photographers.
other thing is like you come into a photography school and maybe you've been photographing on your own for a while. Maybe you got an Instagram that's growing and whatnot. Keep your mind open though. Don't come into a school thinking you know everything about photography, because I'm here to tell you, you do not, right? It is a huge world of photography, and be open to learning, be open to experiences, be open to listening to your instructors when they talk to you about making sure you get really good exposures, because you can do a lot with a really good exposure in post production.
Mm-hmm.
A really poor exposure, you're really limited with what you can do in post production.
I feel like I know where that advice is coming from. There seems to be a trend where people are really processing things super dark, or no, they're shooting super dark,
Photographing super dark.
thinking that
Yeah.
they that's the look they want, but they could do that in post and still have a good exposure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
because when they underexpose, they're crushing their shadows.
Mm-hmm. And
And
maybe
there's
they
no
didn't
detail.
intend for it to be like that.
Yeah, and there's no detail in
Yeah.
their shadows. It's just mushy and muddy.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they give a good exposure and then in post production kind of make it darker and you have all that detail in the shadows,
Mm-hmm.
um, the illumination in eyes of students when they get to that point of realizing my work looks so much better now that I'm actually doing this correctly and
Mm-hmm.
crafting my vision in post production
Mm-hmm.
to, giving myself really good raw material and then crafting it more in post production,
Mm-hmm.
and not trying to get it out of the camera as a JPEG the way that I think it should look. Right.
Yeah.
And their work skyrockets, their self-esteem skyrockets, their
Mm-hmm.
ideas, they start expanding their ideas more.
Mm-hmm.
It's really great to see. So yeah, the advice to students is keep an open mind going in, and photography is a big world. Learn about as much of it as you can.
Mm-hmm.
You'll never really know where your influences might come from. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I've had influences in my photography that my work looks nothing like theirs, but they still influence
Mm-hmm.
my photography.
Yeah,
They
totally.
influence my thought process. They influence what I'm looking at when I'm going out with my camera. Um, so yeah, just keep an open mind, be humble, and do the work. The only way to get better at making photographs is to make more photographs, but you have
Yep.
to review the work you've done, learn from it, and keep pushing forward. Don't be afraid to fail. You'll learn a lot from your failures, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, when I have something fail, initially it's like, oh shoot, but then I start diving into it and figure out, okay, what failed, what went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Can I use anything from this in the future, or do I just need to keep in mind the lessons I'm learning here and apply them moving forward? So yeah, that's a lot of it right there. There's a
Yeah.
lot of advice for young students coming up.
Yeah, no, it's all great advice, and I think that's a really great place to leave off for this episode of Focus Stacked. Thanks for coming and hanging out with me today, Shawn.
Absolutely. Glad to do it, Jim.
All right. I appreciate it. Everyone. Shawn's website, please go check that out. And you have a show coming up too, right?
I have a show coming up. I don't have the dates right now in front of me. Mid April through mid May, I believe. Be on RimCAD campus, Epic Corner Gallery, and it'll be that Remnant show.
Okay.
And they're going to be kind of grouped together like you would group family pictures together on a wall. Kind of remembering, a remembrance of times that used to be.
Okay. And they might be able to see that on your Instagram?
Yes, I will. I'll be showing, I'm going to be kind of doing a run up to this launch of the show, including a little video of one of the prints being printed on a large format printer, watching the print head move back and forth and create the image.
That sounds so exciting.
Yeah. And then some individual images and then the show itself. So, but yeah, I'll have it on my Instagram.
All right. Awesome. Well, again, thank you for sharing all of your background and your work, and we'll see everyone on the next episode. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and leave us a comment. It helps us connect with more photography lovers just like you.